Former President Donald Trump committed fraud, according to a ruling by a New York judge. The judge ruled Tuesday that Trump and his company sought lower taxes and better insurance coverage by reporting false values of their assets. New York Attorney General Letitia James filed the civil lawsuit against Mr. Trump and his company, accusing his company of deceiving banks and insurers and inflating his net worth by as much as $2 billion. In addition to Trump, co-defendants include his sons, Eric and Donald Jr., as well as the Trump Organization, two of its former executives, and other businesses. The ruling strips some of Trump's business licenses, making it difficult for him to do business in New York State. An independent monitor will continue to oversee the Trump Organization.
Hello and welcome, guys. Dr. John is here. This is happening right now. A New York judge has found Trump liable for systematic financial fraud, concluding he overstated his net worth by as much as $2.2 billion over more than a decade. Specific examples include valuing Mar-a-Lago at $600 million when its true worth was closer to $27 million, and inflating 40 Wall Street's value by $300 million, a scheme that allowed Trump to secure loans and insurance through deliberate deception. The Trump Tower apartment, the residence that Trump has presented as the pinnacle of his real estate achievements, was another example of this systematic fraud. Trump claimed the apartment was 30,000 square feet, a sprawling residence that would be one of the largest in Manhattan, but the judge found its actual size to be approximately 11,000 square feet, a tripling of the space that represented a deliberate and knowing falsehood.
The answer is no, because what ultimately happens is the Attorney General will cease to allow those companies to exist by pulling the licenses, by pulling its license to be active in the state of New York. So all of those assets will end up going into some form of a receivership. And as a result of the receivership, the companies will end up getting liquidated.
Trump's lawyer says the former president will appeal the decision.
This wasn't a rounding error or an honest mistake. It was a pattern of deception that was designed to make Trump's properties appear more valuable than they actually were, allowing him to secure better loans, lower insurance rates, and a higher net worth that he could use to impress lenders and business partners. The penalties that the judge imposed reflect the seriousness of the fraud and the scale of the deception. Trump has been ordered to pay more than $450 million, a figure that includes both the disgorgement of ill-gotten gains and interest that has accrued during the years of litigation.
A New York judge now ruling that former President Donald Trump committed fraud and lied about his net worth for years. And according to the court documents to send to us, Mr. Trump apparently, according to this judge, lied to banks and insurers, exaggerating his net worth to the tune of something like billions of dollars. This is all ahead of a civil trial that is set to begin on Monday. I want to get right to Tom Winter. Explain what the judge is saying here and its significance.
Right. So the judge is basically saying that the Attorney General for the state of New York, Letitia James, came forward with a civil complaint last year and said that the former president, through his businesses and his personal financial representations, committed fraud by overstating his personal wealth and the wealth of his properties, how much his properties are worth, even the square footage, in a now famous or infamous example that the Attorney General's office said, where Trump multiplied the square footage of his Trump Tower apartment by 3, from 10,000 to 30,000 square feet, to put a certain price on it to include in his statement of financial conditions. The judge saying here today that he agrees with the Attorney General that, in fact,
this is not a small fine that Trump can write a check for and move on from. It is a massive financial hit that will constrain his operations and limit his ability to do business for years to come. The judge also imposed a 3-year ban on Trump serving as an officer or director of any New York company, effectively preventing him from running the businesses that have been the foundation of his wealth and identity. The ban on New York bank loans is perhaps even more damaging than the financial penalty, because it cuts off Trump's access to the capital that his business model depends on. Trump's real estate empire is built on leverage, buying properties with borrowed money and refinancing them regularly to extract cash for other projects. Without access to New York banks,
Trump, his companies, etc., have committed fraud here. Now, the remaining question for a trial, it's going to be a bench trial that's slated to happen in October, Hallie, is just how much the Trump organization and Donald Trump and some of his kids will have to disgorge, basically give back to the state of New York for committing this fraud. So that's a significant question among some others that will likely come up and have to come up at this trial. In addition to that, he fined $7,500 to each of Donald Trump's attorneys for continuing to bring up arguments, he says, that he has previously ruled on, that the appellate courts in the state of New York, the First Appellate Division, has made rulings on, and continue to say and suggest that the Attorney General cannot bring these types of charges or suit, rather, and on top of that, cannot continue to make some of the arguments. So the judge here pretty solidly condemning the Trump organization and the former president. We'll have to see what happens at trial, Hallie, and just how much money potentially the former president has to put forward.
Trump will have to find alternative sources of financing, including smaller lenders, foreign investors, and private equity firms that are likely to charge higher interest rates and impose more restrictive terms. The ban effectively freezes Trump's ability to do business in New York, the city where his empire was built and where his most valuable properties are located. The appointment of a compliance officer and independent director is another devastating consequence of the judgment because it represents the court's judgment that Trump cannot be trusted to run his own businesses without oversight. The compliance officer will monitor Trump's financial statements, review his deals, and report any suspicious activity to the court, ensuring that Trump cannot simply continue his fraudulent practices under a new guise. The independent director will have authority over major business decisions, preventing Trump from making the kind of unilateral moves that characterized his previous operations. For a man who has always prided himself on being his own boss and controlling every aspect of his businesses, this oversight is a humiliating reminder that he is no longer trusted to manage his own affairs. The significance of this case extends far beyond the specific penalties imposed because it represents a fundamental challenge to the myth of Trump as a successful businessman. For decades, Trump has presented himself as the ultimate dealmaker, a man who built an empire through hard work, business acumen, and the art of the deal. The New York judgment strips away that mythology and reveals the truth that has always been lurking beneath the surface. Trump's wealth was built not on genuine success, but on systematic fraud and deception. He didn't build an empire, he inflated one, using false financial statements, bogus property valuations, and outright lies to create an illusion of wealth that allowed him to borrow money and strike deals that his actual net worth would never have supported. The federal government's failure to pursue this kind of case is a gap in accountability that the New York Attorney General stepped in to fill. For reasons that remain unclear, federal prosecutors never brought a sweeping financial fraud case against Trump, despite having access to his financial records and the investigative resources to build such a case. Perhaps they believed the case was too difficult to prove. Perhaps they were concerned about political backlash. Perhaps they were limited by Justice Department policies or legal theories that constrained their ability to pursue a broad financial fraud case. Whatever the reason, the federal government's failure to act left a vacuum that New York was willing and able to fill. The Manhattan District Attorney's separate criminal case against the Trump Corporation adds another layer of accountability to the picture because it resulted in a jury conviction for criminal tax fraud, a finding that the company had engaged in a scheme to evade taxes on executive compensation. This was a criminal conviction, not a civil judgment, and it carries its own set of consequences, including a criminal fine and the permanent stain of a criminal record. Together with the civil fraud judgment, the criminal conviction creates a comprehensive accountability picture that shows Trump and his organization engaged in a pattern of illegal conduct that went far beyond isolated incidents or honest mistakes. The state-level nature of these cases is crucial to understanding why they matter so much, because state judgments are not subject to presidential pardons or federal immunity rulings. If Trump were to win all of his federal cases, if he were to receive federal pardons or obtain immunity rulings from federal courts, the New York judgments would still stand, enforceable and inescapable. Trump still owes New York the $450 million, still cannot run companies or get loans in New York, still faces the oversight of the compliance officer and independent director. State courts are not controlled by federal politics, and their judgments represent a form of accountability that no federal action can erase. The implications of this judgment for Trump's political future are profound because the finding that he engaged in systematic fraud goes to the heart of the identity he has constructed for himself and the basis of his appeal to voters. Trump's political brand has always been built on his business success, the idea that he is a wealthy, successful businessman who can apply his deal-making skills to government. If that business success is revealed to be built on fraud and deception, the foundation of his political appeal begins to crumble. Voters who were attracted to Trump because they believed he was a successful businessman may reconsider their support when they learn that his success was built on lies and illegal conduct. The national political community is watching this case closely because it represents a test of whether the legal system can hold powerful people accountable even when they have used their power and wealth to try to evade accountability. Trump has spent years claiming that the legal system is rigged against him, that his prosecutions are politically motivated, and that he is the victim of a witch hunt. The New York judgment shows that the legal system can still function, that judges can still evaluate evidence impartially, and that even a former president can be held accountable for fraud. This is a powerful message that resonates far beyond Trump himself. The compliance officer and independent director, who will now oversee Trump's businesses, represent a level of oversight that is unprecedented for a former president and that will constrain his ability to operate for years to come. Every major financial decision, every significant transaction, every attempt to borrow money or refinance a property will require review and approval, ensuring that Trump cannot simply continue his fraudulent practices under a new guise. For a man who has always insisted on total control of his business operations, this oversight will be a daily reminder that his empire is no longer his own and that his freedom to operate has been severely curtailed. The broader message of this case is that no one, not even a former president, is above the law. Trump has spent years believing that his wealth, his power, and his political connections would protect him from consequences, that he could bend the rules to his advantage and nothing would ever happen to him. The New York judgment proves otherwise, showing that the legal system can still function and that those who break the law can be held accountable. This is a powerful precedent that should give pause to anyone who believes they can operate outside the bounds of the law, and it is a victory for the principle that justice should be blind to wealth, status, and political power. The specific findings of the New York judgment provide a devastating picture of how Trump's business empire was actually built, and the details are damning enough to strip away any remaining pretense that Trump was a legitimate businessman. The judge found that Trump had engaged in a decade-long scheme to inflate his net worth, presenting financial statements that were filled with false valuations and misleading information to lenders, insurers, and business partners. This was not a series of isolated mistakes or misunderstandings. It was a deliberate and systematic pattern of conduct that was designed to deceive and defraud the people and institutions that relied on Trump's representations for their own business decisions. The financial statements that Trump submitted to banks and insurance companies were works of fiction, presenting properties as being worth far more than their actual market value, inflating the square footage of his buildings, and claiming that properties were generating income that they were not. The judge found that Trump had overstated his net worth by billions of dollars, a figure that represented not just an exaggeration, but a fundamental misrepresentation of his true financial position. Banks that relied on these false statements made loans that they would not have made if they had known the truth, and insurers that relied on these false statements wrote policies that they would not have written if they had known the truth. The fraud was not victimless. It caused real harm to the institutions that were deceived. The Mar-a-Lago valuation is one of the most egregious examples of Trump's fraudulent practices because it shows how a property that Trump has presented as one of his most valuable assets was actually worth a fraction of what he claimed. The $600 million valuation that Trump placed on the estate represented a 20-fold inflation of its true value, a disparity that cannot be explained by honest differences of opinion or legitimate valuation disputes. Trump knew that Mar-a-Lago was not worth $600 million. He knew that the property was restricted by zoning regulations and preservation covenants that limited its development potential. But he claimed the higher valuation anyway because it served his purposes of presenting a higher net worth to lenders and business partners. The 40 Wall Street valuation is another example of the same pattern, with Trump claiming the building was worth more than $500 million when its true value was closer to $200 million. This $300 million gap represents not just a valuation dispute, but a deliberate misrepresentation designed to defraud the institutions that relied on Trump's statements. Banks that loan money based on the inflated valuation were taking risks that they did not understand. Insurers who wrote policies based on the inflated valuation were charging premiums that did not reflect the true risk, and business partners who entered into deals based on the inflated valuation were making decisions based on false information. The Trump Tower apartment valuation is perhaps the most blatant example of Trump's willingness to lie about the basic facts of his properties, because the claimed size of the apartment could be easily verified by anyone with access to building records or blueprints. Trump claimed the apartment was 30,000 square feet, a figure that would make it one of the largest residences in Manhattan, but its true size was approximately 11,000 square feet, less than half of what he claimed. This was not a subtle exaggeration, it was a threefold inflation of the square footage, a lie so obvious that it cannot be explained as anything other than a deliberate attempt to deceive. The apartment was not as large as Trump claimed, and its value was not as high as Trump claimed, and the banks and insurers who relied on Trump's statements were being defrauded as a result. The timing of the fraudulent practices is also significant because Trump's pattern of inflation continued for more than a decade, becoming more aggressive as his financial needs grew and his business opportunities expanded. The judge found that Trump's fraudulent statements were not limited to a few isolated transactions, but were part of his regular business practice, a way of doing business that was so ingrained that Trump seemed to believe it was normal. This is not a man who made a few mistakes or engaged in a few exaggerations. This is a man who built his entire business empire on a foundation of fraud and deception, and who continued his fraudulent practices even as the risks of getting caught grew larger. The difference between the New York case and the federal cases against Trump is stark and revealing, because it shows how the federal government's narrower focus on specific crimes has left gaps in accountability that states are stepping in to fill. The federal government indicted Trump for election obstruction and for his actions on January 6th, but they never brought a sweeping financial fraud case that challenged the very foundations of his business empire. Perhaps federal prosecutors believed that such a case would be too difficult to prove. Perhaps they were constrained by Justice Department policies that limit their ability to pursue certain kinds of cases. Perhaps they were simply less aggressive than their state counterparts. Whatever the reason, the federal government's failure to act left the door open for New York to step in and do what the feds would not. The Manhattan District Attorney's criminal case against the Trump Corporation adds another dimension to the accountability picture, because it represents a criminal conviction that carries its own set of consequences. The jury's finding that the company engaged in criminal tax fraud is a separate and independent finding of guilt that cannot be dismissed as a civil dispute or a political attack. This is a criminal conviction, which means the company was found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of breaking the law, and it carries a criminal record that will follow the Trump Organization for years. Together with the civil fraud judgment, the criminal conviction creates a comprehensive record of illegal conduct that is difficult to explain away or minimize. The implications of these cases for Trump's ability to raise money and conduct business are profound, because the judgments and bans limit his access to the capital and credit that his business model depends on. Trump needs to borrow money to finance his operations, refinance his properties, and extract cash for other projects, and without access to New York banks, those options become much more limited. Alternative lenders are more expensive, more restrictive, and more likely to require personal guarantees that put Trump's other assets at risk. The compliance officer and independent director add another layer of oversight that will make it harder for Trump to operate in the shadowy ways that characterized his previous business dealings. The personal consequences for Trump are also significant because the judgment serves as an official legal finding that he is a fraudster, a designation that will follow him for the rest of his life. Every loan application, every insurance application, every business deal will now be viewed in the context of the judgment, and potential partners will think twice before doing business with someone who has been found liable for systematic fraud. Trump's reputation as a businessman, the foundation of his political identity, has been permanently damaged by the judgment, and there is no appeal or pardon that can erase the finding of fraud or restore the trust that he has lost. The political implications of the judgment are equally significant because Trump's political appeal has always been built on his business success and his claim to be a successful dealmaker. If that claim is revealed to be based on fraud and deception, if Trump's wealth is shown to be more illusion than reality, then the foundation of his political appeal begins to crumble. Voters who were attracted to Trump because they believed he was a successful businessman may reconsider their support, and voters who were willing to overlook his other flaws because of his business success may find it harder to do so. The judgment gives Trump's opponents a powerful new weapon to use against him, a legal finding of fraud that can be cited in debates and campaign ads for years to come. The broader message of the judgment is that the legal system can still function, and that powerful people can be held accountable when they break the law. Trump's years of claiming that the legal system is rigged against him, that his prosecutions are politically motivated, and that he is the victim of a witch hunt have been undermined by the judgment, which shows a judge evaluating evidence impartially and imposing penalties based on the facts. The judgment demonstrates that the legal system is not a tool of partisan prosecution, but a functional institution that can hold powerful people accountable when they step out of bounds. The New York Attorney General's persistence in pursuing this case over 3 years of investigation and litigation is a testament to the importance of state-level accountability in a system where federal enforcement is sometimes lacking. Attorney General Letitia James faced enormous pressure to drop the case from Trump's political supporters, from business interests, and from those who believed that a former president should be immune from prosecution. She persisted anyway because she believed in the rule of law and the principle that no one is above accountability, and her persistence has resulted in one of the most significant civil fraud judgments in American history. The judgment also sends a message to other wealthy and powerful people who believe they can operate outside the bounds of the law, showing them that states are willing and able to hold them accountable when the federal government does not. This is particularly important at a time when many Americans believe that the wealthy and powerful are insulated from consequences, that they can break the law with impunity and never face repercussions. The New York judgment shows that this is not always true, that there are still institutions willing to hold the powerful accountable, and that the legal system can still function as a check on the abuse of power. The legacy of the judgment will extend far beyond Trump himself because it represents a precedent that can be used against other fraudsters and other institutions that engage in systematic deception. The legal theories that the New York Attorney General used to prove Trump's fraud, the evidence that she marshaled, and the arguments that she made will be studied by prosecutors and plaintiffs' lawyers for years to come. The judgment is not just a penalty against Trump, it is a blueprint for future accountability, a roadmap for how to prove fraud against powerful defendants who have used their wealth and influence to try to evade accountability. The final and most significant dimension of the New York judgment is what it reveals about the relationship between wealth, power, and accountability in the American legal system, because the judgment demonstrates that even the most powerful and wealthy individuals can be held accountable when they break the law. Trump's years of claiming that he is above the law, that his wealth and political power make him immune from consequences, have been proven false by the judgment. The courts have spoken, the judge has ruled, and Trump has been found liable for fraud, a finding that cannot be appealed away or ignored out of existence. The practical consequences of the judgment are already being felt in Trump's business operations because the compliance officer and independent director have begun their work of overseeing his financial activities and ensuring that he does not continue his fraudulent practices. Every significant transaction must be reviewed and approved. Every major financial decision must be documented and justified, and any attempt to evade the judgment or circumvent the oversight will be reported to the court. This is the kind of scrutiny that Trump has always tried to avoid, and it represents a level of accountability that he has never before faced. The ban on New York bank loans is particularly significant because it cuts off Trump's access to the capital that his business model depends on, forcing him to find alternative sources of financing that are more expensive and less reliable. New York banks have long been the lifeblood of Trump's business empire, providing the credit and financing that allowed him to buy properties, refinance existing assets, and extract cash for other projects. Without access to those banks, Trump will have to rely on private lenders, foreign investors, and other alternative sources that are likely to impose more stringent terms and higher costs. This will make it harder for Trump to maintain his business operations and will limit his ability to pursue new opportunities. The judgment also creates a series of cascading consequences that will affect Trump's ability to operate in other jurisdictions, because other states and other regulators will look at the New York finding and reconsider their own relationships with Trump and his businesses. Banks in other states may follow the lead of New York banks and cut off their relationships with Trump. Insurance companies may raise their rates or refuse to write policies. Business partners may demand more stringent terms or walk away from deals. The judgment is not limited to New York. It creates a broader environment of suspicion and caution that will follow Trump wherever he tries to do business. The appeal process is the one avenue of hope for Trump because his lawyers will have the opportunity to challenge the judgment in appellate courts and argue that the trial judge made errors of law or fact that require reversal. Appeals are a normal part of the legal process, and they can result in judgments being reduced, reversed, or modified. But appeals take time, and they cost money, and they are by no means guaranteed to succeed. In the meantime, the judgment remains in place, the penalties remain in force, and Trump remains subject to the oversight and restrictions that the judgment imposes. The strategic significance of the judgment in the broader pattern of Trump's legal troubles is also worth noting because it represents a form of accountability that is distinct from the federal criminal cases that have garnered most of the media attention. The federal cases are subject to the political dynamics of the Justice Department and the courts, and they could be derailed by changes in administration or shifts in legal doctrine. The state cases are different. They are not subject to federal policy or presidential pardon, and they represent a more durable form of accountability that will survive changes in the federal political landscape. The judgment also has implications for Trump's political future because it provides a concrete and specific finding of fraud that can be used against him in campaigns and debates. Trump's claim to be a successful businessman has always been a central pillar of his political identity, and the judgment challenges that claim in a way that cannot be dismissed as partisan politics or media bias. The judgment says, in the words of a judge, that Trump engaged in systematic fraud and that finding will follow him for the rest of his political career, a permanent stain on his reputation that cannot be washed away by spin or denial. The broader meaning of the judgment for the American legal system is also significant because it demonstrates that the legal system can still function as a check on the abuse of power, even in cases involving wealthy and politically connected defendants. There has been a growing concern in recent years that the legal system is failing to hold the powerful accountable, that wealth and connections can buy immunity from consequences, and that the rule of law is being eroded by the influence of money and power. The New York judgment challenges that narrative, showing that the legal system can still work and that even a former president can be held liable for fraud. The judgment also sends a message to other state attorneys general and prosecutors around the country, encouraging them to be bold in pursuing cases against powerful defendants and not to be intimidated by the political or personal power of those they are investigating. New York has shown that state-level enforcement can be effective, that state courts can impose meaningful penalties, and that state prosecutors can build successful cases against even the most powerful and well-connected defendants. This is a precedent that will encourage other states to follow New York's lead, potentially leading to additional cases against Trump and his businesses in other jurisdictions. The judgment is a reminder that the United States is a system of divided sovereignty, with both federal and state governments having the authority to enforce the law and hold wrongdoers accountable. The federal government may have chosen not to pursue a sweeping financial fraud case against Trump, but New York was willing and able to do so, and the result is a judgment that imposes real consequences on Trump and his businesses. This is federalism at work, a system in which states can serve as laboratories of accountability and check the abuse of power when the federal government is unwilling or unable to do so. The time that it takes for legal accountability to arrive is also worth noting, because the New York judgment comes after years of investigation, litigation, and appeals. Justice is often slow, particularly in cases involving powerful defendants with unlimited resources to fight the process, but it does eventually arrive. The judgment shows that persistence pays off, that prosecutors who stay the course and build careful cases can ultimately succeed, and that the legal system can deliver accountability even after years of delays and procedural challenges. The New York fraud judgment ensures history will remember Trump not as a successful businessman, but as a fraudster who built his empire on deception, with a permanent mark on his legacy that cannot be disputed. More broadly, the ruling restores faith in accountability by proving that even the most powerful can face consequences, delivering a warning that fraud does not pay and the law eventually catches up.